There are stories that history never wrote down, stories it keeps instead in the quiet spaces between ages, lands that vanished, civilizations swallowed by the sea, memories softened by wind and water. Atlantis is one of those stories. Not just a legend, not just a tale retold by Plato, but a meeting point between geology, imagination, and humanity's longing for the worlds we have lost. When ancient people watched the shoreline slip backward, when they saw volcanoes erupt or earthquakes level entire cities, they had no scientific language to explain what was happening. All they had were stories. And over thousands of years, those stories transformed into a legend about a radiant land taken by the sea in a single day and night. Tonight, on Historical Storytell, we are not here to chase a sunken continent or hunt for mystical secrets. Instead, we return to fragments of memory that are real. The Minoan civilization, the Thera eruption, the drowned cities beneath the waves, and the way Plato shaped all of it into an allegory about power and decline. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind open the way a calm night sea opens beneath the stars. Because this is not only a journey into the story of Atlantis, this is a journey into us, how we built the worlds we live in, and how easily those worlds can slip away. Welcome to tonight's story. Welcome to Historical Storytell. From the idea of geological memory and the vanished lands of our ancient world, the story of Atlantis gently leads us back to the only person who ever wrote it down, Plato. In all of classical Greece, he is the sole source of this legend, and that makes tracing how the story reached him just as important as the story itself. Plato wrote that its earliest teller was a group of Egyptian priests in Sais, a city known for preserving records far older than those of Greece. These priests shared the story with Solon, one of the 7 sages of Greece, when he traveled to Egypt to learn about their calendar and their traditions. Solon returned home and began putting the tale into poetry, but he died before finishing it. His relatives kept the unfinished manuscript and eventually passed it down to the ancestors of Plato. Through this long chain of storytellers, the memory of a disaster moved across cultures, from the halls of Egyptian temples to the study rooms of Athens. And when Plato retold it, the story absorbed the tone and structure of his philosophy. Because of that, even though Atlantis appears in Timaeus and Critias with striking detail, we can feel 2 currents running side by side. One is the original memory of a lost land, and the other is Plato's philosophical lens shaping it. In Timaeus, the story serves as a backdrop for his ideas about the nature of the universe, the ideal order of the world, and how city-states can maintain balance between morality and power. In Critias, he sets Atlantis against ancient Athens, not the historical Athens, but Athens as an ideal. Atlantis becomes both a mighty nation and a symbol of moral decay when ambition outruns virtue. Because of this political and philosophical framing, the first half of the Atlantis narrative reads like a mirror, reflecting how easily a prosperous society can lose its sense of moderation. This blend of ancient memory and philosophy is also why modern readers often misunderstand Atlantis as a super-civilization. Plato described a wealthy empire with concentric cities, powerful fleets, and impressive temples. But these were symbolic motifs rather than geographic facts. They were visual metaphors for the type of society he wanted to critique. When these images entered the modern world, a world accustomed to searching for the extraordinary, to believing in lost continents and forgotten technologies, Atlantis was quickly taken out of context. Without the political backdrop of classical Athens, and without an understanding of how Greek philosophers used imaginary states to explore moral ideas, many people today read Plato's narrative as literal history rather than allegory. And because of that, a fragment of geological memory passed down through generations became a symbol stretched through countless lenses: the archaeological lens, the mystical lens, and the lens of modern pop culture. People today often forget that Plato never claimed Atlantis possessed advanced technology. He simply described a flourishing maritime society, something completely consistent with Mediterranean cultures of that era. But once fragments of his narrative entered a world hungry for wonder, they were magnified into stories of mysterious machines, lost energies, and impossible architecture. The core message changed. What began as a philosophical warning about moral decline transformed into a global treasure hunt for a super civilization that never existed. In Plato's telling, Atlantis was never supernatural. It was a portrait of wealth, pride, and eventual collapse. And because he wrote it as philosophy, not archaeology, the misunderstandings were almost inevitable. Yet when we look at Atlantis through a historical lens, it becomes much closer to reality than popular culture suggests. It aligns with memories of real disasters, with the rise and fall of real coastal societies, and with a very human fear: the fear that everything built over generations can be swept away in a single moment. By understanding the philosophical context Plato wove into his story, it becomes clear that the Atlantis of the original text never carried the shape of a super civilization, the way modern audiences imagine it. When examined through a scientific lens, the first step is to strip away centuries of added interpretations, layers that have turned Atlantis into a place of mysterious technologies, strange machines, or structures far beyond its time. Archaeology has found no evidence to support the idea that any prehistoric culture possessed pyramid-like monuments or massive stone cities hidden in the deep sea. Every so-called report of an underwater pyramid follows the same familiar pattern: blurry photographs, natural formations mistaken for buildings, or exaggerated interpretations of rock shapes carved by tides and tectonic forces. Geologists who study these regions reach the same conclusion again and again. The seafloor shows no trace of ancient human construction dating anywhere near the period Plato described. Beyond the absence of architecture, the idea of advanced technology in Atlantis also collapses when placed next to real historical context. Descriptions of Atlantis as a nation with levitation devices, secret energy sources, or intricate machinery are inventions of the 19th century, a time when the West was swept up in occult movements and the romanticization of the distant past. In Plato's original setting, he never implied that the people of Atlantis possessed technology ahead of their age. He described them simply as a wealthy society with organized military forces and a strong maritime presence, traits entirely normal for Mediterranean civilizations of that period. The concentric canals, multicolored temple walls, and wide harbors, he mentioned, fall well within the technical capabilities already known in the Aegean and North Africa at the time. Atlantis was never meant to possess supernatural power. Modern imaginations projected that onto it. When we revisit Plato's description through the combined lens of archaeology and geography, Atlantis becomes far more grounded if placed among the cultures of the Mediterranean that existed around the era of his writing. A maritime civilization with complex cities, canal systems, grand temples, and far-reaching influence fits perfectly with what we know about the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, or the island communities of the Aegean. These cultures had refined arts, expansive trade networks, and lived under the constant influence of a geologically active region. Plato's details, from temple designs to city structures to emphasis on naval strength, do not push Atlantis beyond the world of reality. They actually anchor it more firmly within the archaeological record of Crete, Santorini, and Cyprus. All of this points to a simple truth. The story of Atlantis, rather than being a map to a lost super-civilization, was likely a blend of real memories of a natural disaster and a political allegory Plato wanted to construct. There was no mystical society that vanished beneath the deep ocean, no forgotten machinery waiting to be rediscovered, only a story enlarged over time by human imagination and longing. And when we place Atlantis back in its proper context, we see that it never needed mystery to be powerful. It is compelling precisely because it mirrors what happened to so many coastal societies, cultures that once flourished, remained vulnerable, and left behind gaps in human memory when nature shifted the course of history. When we look at Atlantis through a scientific lens instead of the layers of modern imagination, we begin to see that the story's lasting power has never depended on the existence of a super civilization. Its strength lies in the fact that it mirrors a real phenomenon in Earth's history: the disappearance of countless coastal communities after the last ice age. Over a long, slow span, like the quiet breathing of the planet, the sea rose more than 100 meters above its glacial maximum. This change did not happen in a single day, but it also did not unfold slowly enough for ancient people to fully adapt. For them, a rise of just a few meters could erase an entire valley, an old riverbank, or a fishing village that had existed for generations. And when memories are passed from one generation to the next, events that unfolded over centuries can be felt as sudden, as if the land were swallowed by the sea in a single night. This perspective helps us understand the environment in which the Atlantis story could have originated. After the ice melted, vast plains gradually became ocean. Fertile coastal flats turned into deep bays. From Southeast Asia's Sundaland to the Mediterranean, continental shelves disappeared without warning, burying thousands of human settlements. Modern archaeology, despite its progress, has explored only a small portion of the underwater world. Yet even within that small portion, researchers keep finding traces of ancient villages, submerged harbors, and streets lying deep beneath the waves. These discoveries show that tales of lands taken by the sea are not spawned from imagination. They reflect real experiences shared by countless communities who lived by the shore. Seen through the eyes of ancient people, it becomes clear why they might describe these changes as the collapse of an entire civilization. A fishing village disappears, then a small town, then an entire stretch of coastline, all blending into a collective memory of continuous loss. And that memory, carried across many generations, could crystallize into stories about a great kingdom falling into the sea. From this viewpoint, Atlantis no longer needs to be a mysterious empire. It becomes a collective memory of communities who lost their land, their homes, and the stories they once told about themselves. Over long spans of time, these memories accumulated, merged, and eventually formed a shared image, one that Plato happened to record in writing. What makes this even more powerful is that the geological shifts of that era were far beyond the understanding of societies without writing or scientific knowledge. For them, the only explanation for the sea advancing dozens of kilometers inland was the will of gods or punishment for some moral failing. As a result, stories of sunken lands carried both natural truth, because the events really happened, and symbolic meaning, because people interpreted those events through the lens of fear, faith, and myth. In this sense, Atlantis becomes a universal silhouette of all the vanished coastal towns, a memory not tied to any single place, but rooted in the human experience, stretching back to prehistory. And when we see Atlantis as part of this phenomenon, the story becomes far more convincing than any supernatural theory. It needs no secret technology and no lost continent. Its power comes from reflecting real events that shaped the lives of ancient coastal peoples. These were people who lived at the edge of the water, who heard the waves against their homes, who watched the land slip away beneath their feet, and who preserved that loss in stories, stories that Plato later gathered into a single form. When we look deeper into the natural environment surrounding the Mediterranean, we begin to see why stories of lands swallowed by the sea appear so frequently in the myths of the peoples who lived there. This region, calm and sunlit on the surface, dotted with small islands, is actually one of the most complex tectonic zones on Earth. The crust beneath it is constantly shifting, colliding, and grinding past itself, producing a chain of powerful geological events. Frequent earthquakes, major volcanic eruptions, undersea landslides, and tsunamis capable of wiping out entire communities in a very short span of time. For ancient people, these upheavals were not rare anomalies. They were part of the rhythm of the place they lived, a rhythm sometimes quiet, sometimes violent, shaping their worldview and their collective memory. Classical Greek history records many stories that modern science can easily explain through geology. Chroniclers described villages that cracked open and sank within hours, farmlands swallowed by the sea in a single afternoon, and bustling harbors that vanished overnight due to undersea collapse. The Greeks had no concept of plate tectonics or crustal movement. All they knew was that the ground shook violently, opened beneath them, and the sea surged forward to take whatever stood in its path. These experiences, passed down from generation to generation, carried both the sharpness of real memory and the haze of mystery born from their attempts to interpret nature. Out of moments like these, the image of the sunken land became a recurring motif in Greek and Mediterranean mythology. In a world where nature constantly reshaped the landscape, human memory did not exist only in stories, it carved itself into collective psychology. Coastal people knew that a strong earthquake could make the seabed collapse and send tsunamis racing dozens of kilometers inland. They knew that a volcanic eruption could erase more than a city. It could bury entire regions under ash, leaving little behind for future eyes to find. And they knew that once the earth split deeply enough, small settlements along the shore could disappear so quickly that survivors had time only to carry a few belongings and a handful of stories. In that era, myth and reality blended naturally, because people did not yet have the tools to separate them the way we do now. Placed against this backdrop, the story of Atlantis becomes far less strange and far more reasonable. It reads not as a tale of magical catastrophe, but as the natural product of a region in constant turmoil, where stability was temporary and memories of disaster were easily magnified or mythologized through time. Plato may not have been recounting a single event. He may have been echoing a collage of centuries' worth of geological trauma, memories layered together into the image of a brilliant land that fell into the sea. And it is within this Mediterranean instability that the legend of Atlantis finds its true foundation, not the foundation of a mystical super-civilization lost by supernatural means, but the foundation of real experiences witnessed by real people. The earth opening, the sea rising, and lives erased in spans too short for anyone to record. The blend of harsh reality and ancient imagination became the fertile soil in which a myth like Atlantis could take root and endure across thousands of years. Amid the turbulent geological landscape of the Mediterranean, there once existed a civilization so vibrant it became the heart of the entire region, only to fade as swiftly as a shadow erased by new light. This was the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, a culture not born of myth, but entirely real, recorded through archaeology, art, and the remains of its cities. And when we look closely at them, we begin to understand why so many researchers consider the Minoans the most convincing candidates behind the image Plato painted of Atlantis. not because they possessed mysterious technology, but because their society, architecture, and deep relationship with the sea align almost effortlessly with the world Plato described. The Minoans flourished between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, positioned at the crossroads of major trade routes connecting Egypt, the Near East, and Greece. They built complex urban centers like Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea, multi-story palaces with wide corridors, ceremonial courtyards, and vast storage complexes. Notably, these palaces lacked defensive walls, suggesting they trusted their naval strength and saw the sea as their natural fortress. Their art was remarkably refined, filled with vivid frescoes depicting dolphins, ships, coastal life, and religious scenes. All of this made them one of the earliest true maritime civilizations, where the sea was not only their trade route, but also the spiritual and cultural center of their world. When we compare Plato's description of Atlantis with what we know about the Minoans, the parallels stand out clearly. A wealthy seafaring society, brightly decorated buildings, striking architectural colors, canal systems, and powerful naval forces. Archaeology has confirmed all of these on Crete. The Minoans controlled much of the trade across the region, forming an extensive network of exchange. Their cultural influence was so strong that elements of Minoan art and religion appeared in neighboring societies. These traits make them resemble the Sea Empire Plato once sketched in his dialogues. The similarities go beyond architecture and commerce. What captures the attention of scholars most is the way the Minoan civilization disappeared. At a moment when they seemed to be thriving, they were struck by a real catastrophe, the eruption of Thera, Santorini, one of the largest volcanic explosions in human history. Its force blew out the center of the island, sending massive tsunamis toward Crete, destroying coastal cities, crippling the Minoan fleet, and triggering severe economic disruption. Thick layers of ash and climate changes following the eruption damaged agriculture and led to long-term decline. From there, the civilization steadily lost its dominance and became vulnerable to other rising powers in the region. For surrounding cultures, such a catastrophe could not be forgotten quickly. It was an event powerful enough to leave deep marks in memory and myth. A brilliant maritime civilization brought low by a sudden natural disaster. This is precisely the kind of story that could evolve into legends of a prosperous land swallowed by the sea. And as this memory traveled from survivors to Egyptians to Solon and finally to Plato, real features, cities, ships, wealth, and a sudden downfall could have merged with the symbolic layers Plato used to craft his philosophical narrative. So when we take a historical view, the Minoans were not Atlantis in the literal sense, but they may well be the closest inspiration behind it. They stand as living proof that a powerful maritime culture could dominate an entire region and still collapse within a shockingly short window of time due to nature's force. And their rise and fall allow us to see Atlantis not as a super civilization, but as the echo of a real one, beautiful, fragile, and vulnerable to the immense shifts of a world beyond human control. The dazzling rise of the Minoan civilization cannot be separated from the very sea that nourished it, and it was this same sea that became the birthplace of one of the greatest natural disasters in human history. At the center of this chain of events stood the volcano of Thera, known today as Santorini, a volcanic arc resting directly on the tectonic boundary between Europe and Africa. At the time of the disaster, Thera was not the small crescent island we know now, but a vast landmass with a massive crater hidden inside. As pressure from rising magma built to a critical point, it triggered an eruption almost impossible to comprehend in its historical context. Geologists estimate that the explosion was dozens of times stronger than the Krakatoa eruption of 1883, powerful enough to blow out the heart of the island and send shockwaves across the entire Mediterranean. When Thera erupted, an immense plume of ash shot into the atmosphere, spreading across Turkey, Egypt, and far beyond. This ash blanketed farmland, collapsing harvests, and triggering a ripple of consequences. But the most devastating destruction came from the eruption itself. The island's center collapsed into the sea, forming a giant caldera, and that collapse displaced billions of tons of water, generating tsunamis that coastal civilizations had no way to withstand. The waves tore across the Aegean at immense speed, smashing ships, destroying harbors, and shattering the trade network the Minoans had built over generations. Crete, the heart of the Minoan world, lay far too close to escape the devastation. Coastal settlements were flattened, storage facilities swept away, fleets crushed to splinters. The Minoan navy, the very backbone of this maritime empire, suffered losses so severe it could not recover quickly. The tsunamis did more than destroy infrastructure. They severed trade routes to Egypt and the Near East, the economic lifelines of the civilization. As resources dwindled, Minoan influence weakened, creating a power vacuum that neighboring forces, especially the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece, moved quickly to fill. Yet it was not only the tsunamis and the collapse of trade that destabilized this once dominant society. The enormous volume of volcanic ash may have caused long-term climate disruption. Years of poor harvests strained food supplies, leaving the society more fragile than ever. The combination of natural disaster and economic fallout prevented the Minoans from fully recovering. Their grand palaces, symbols of political and spiritual power, were gradually abandoned or taken over by other groups. Over time, the Minoan civilization faded into the shadows of history, leaving behind only fragments of frescoes, shards of brilliant pottery, and a story humanity would only piece together millennia later. When we consider the sheer force of the Thera eruption, we understand why memories of a brilliant land, destroyed in an instant, could endure for so long. For those who survived, the event must have defied every explanation they had. The ground collapsed, the sea rose in towering walls, the sky darkened with ash, images powerful enough to etch themselves into memory forever. Passed from one generation to the next, such memories could easily transform into tales of a mighty kingdom swallowed by the sea. In that sense, Thera was not just a volcano. It was the catalyst that helped shape the stories that later became the foundation of Atlantis. In the collective memory of the Mediterranean, the Thera catastrophe stands as a symbol of how vulnerable maritime civilizations truly were. And it was this vulnerability that allowed stories like Atlantis to endure, not because they described the extraordinary, but because they reflected a truth ancient people knew all too well. A single natural shift was enough to erase the entire world they once called their own. When we place the Thera catastrophe beside Plato's descriptions in Timaeus and Critias, a question that once seemed bold suddenly feels entirely natural. Could Atlantis actually have been the Minoan civilization, or at least a memory reflected from it? What leads many researchers toward this possibility is not the romance of the legend, but the scientific, archaeological, and geographic parallels that line up too closely to dismiss as coincidence. When Plato described a wealthy maritime civilization with great power and wide influence, that description fits the Minoans with remarkable precision, far more than any other ancient society in the Mediterranean. In Plato's telling, Atlantis is portrayed as an island nation whose city was arranged in concentric rings of land and water, with canals dividing 3 rings of earth and 2 rings of sea. Many have taken this detail as literary exaggeration, yet surprisingly, it aligns with the geological structure of ancient Santorini before the eruption. Geological research shows that Thera was once a circular island with a large volcanic crater at its center. When the volcano collapsed, it formed the caldera we see today. But before the disaster, the island's structure closely resembled the interlocking rings that Plato described. No one can say whether Plato had access to maps or accounts from survivors, but the match between his narrative and Santorini's ancient form is striking enough that many scholars believe he was echoing memories from people who once lived in the Aegean. The parallels do not end with the island's circular shape. Plato's description of multicolored building materials, red, black, and white, also mirrors the natural volcanic stones found on Santorini, where layers of ash and pumice create a vivid palette. These details, if purely invented, would be unlikely to align so perfectly with a real landscape. Instead, they suggest Plato may have received the story from sources connected to Minoan memory, and that this memory had traveled through many generations before he set it down in writing. Of course, one of the most common objections is the discrepancy in time. Plato wrote that Atlantis existed and vanished many thousands of years before Solon, while the Thera eruption occurred only about 1,000 years earlier. But in oral storytelling cultures, especially in the ancient world, time was not measured with the strict, chronological precision we use today. A major event could easily be stretched or compressed in collective memory, especially when adapted for philosophical or political commentary. When Solon heard the story from Egyptian priests, the time span might have been rounded or mythologized to fit a more dramatic arc. For ancient storytellers, 1,000 years or 9,000 years did not differ much in symbolic meaning. What mattered was that the event belonged to the deep past, distant enough to feel ancient, mythic, and instructive. Moreover, the alignment between Plato's account and Minoan archaeology goes beyond architecture and geography. It extends to scale and influence. The Minoan civilization dominated Aegean trade, maintaining a vast network of exchange and wielding enough power to influence many surrounding islands. When Plato wrote that Atlantis ruled over the islands and reached even into Europe, he was describing, perhaps unknowingly, a role that mirrors the Minoans at their height. Their decline and disappearance after the Thera disaster created exactly the kind of historical vacuum that could give rise to stories about a great maritime power destroyed by the sea. In this way, the Minoans do not need to be Atlantis in the literal sense. They may instead be the real-world nucleus around which Plato's reconstructed memory formed. A radiant maritime civilization with refined art, distinctive urban planning, and a tragic end. All of it fits the Atlantis motif. And as the story passed from generation to generation, absorbing layers of philosophy, politics, and symbolism, it evolved into the version we know today. No longer a real island, but a fusion of memory, catastrophe, and meaning. If Atlantis is the echo of the Minoans, that does not make the story any less mysterious. In fact, it makes it more compelling. It shows how real memories can transform into enduring symbols, surviving across centuries, expanding beyond their origins, and continuing to fascinate us long after the civilization that inspired them has disappeared. When we look back at the civilizations that once lived around the Mediterranean, we cannot forget that most of them passed through history without leaving a single written record of their own story. This makes their disappearance quieter, more fragile, and far easier to fade into the shadows of time compared to civilizations with strong writing traditions. When a culture no longer has anyone left to speak for it, every memory belonging to it is at risk of falling into silence. Houses, temples, harbors, rituals, these can all be buried by waves, ash, or shifting earth. But the first thing lost is always the voice. And once that voice goes silent, history no longer flows as a continuous narrative, but becomes a scattering of fragments that modern archaeology must painstakingly piece together. This silence becomes even clearer when we realize that what we know about the past is only a tiny sliver of the full picture. Archaeologists estimate that around 90% of the material evidence left by ancient civilizations still lies beyond our reach, buried under unexcavated soil, hidden beneath the deep sea, or locked away in places we are not yet able to explore. This means that most of humanity's story remains out of sight, and what we call history is merely the visible tip of an enormous memory, shaped and eroded by time. These gaps make it difficult to reconstruct civilizations like the Minoans, or any community swallowed by the sea. We see only what remains, not the fullness of what once existed. Because of these gaps, oral tradition became the most important bridge between past and present for thousands of years. Before people wrote down their history, they spoke it, through ceremonies, songs, and the stories elders shared with the young. These stories may shift with time, but they endure for centuries, sometimes longer, especially in communities where collective memory is the only protection their identity has. A major event, a volcanic eruption, a devastating earthquake, a land lost to the sea, could easily survive across countless generations in story form, passing from Egyptians to Solon and from Solon to Plato. Even if the details changed, the core memory remained, that there was once a thriving place, suddenly destroyed by nature. Seen this way, Plato's Atlantis may be one of the rare examples of an ancient oral memory that traveled across centuries and found refuge in writing. We cannot know exactly how many times the story changed, or how many layers of meaning were added with each generation. Yet its survival shows that oral tradition is not merely storytelling. It is the way cultures resist being forgotten. These stories, even when worn down by time, preserve the emotional truth of real events, the last echoes of civilizations that had no written words to record themselves. Through this lens, what matters in Atlantis is not the literal accuracy of every detail, but the meaning behind a memory that has survived through so many generations. It reminds us that what people fear losing most is not their land or their buildings. It is their story. And that story can outlast everything, even when every physical trace has disappeared from the earth. As we follow the journey of the Atlantis story, from oral memory to Plato's written dialogues, we begin to see clearly that what he wanted to convey was never limited to the image of a radiant land swallowed by the sea. For Plato, Atlantis was not simply a location, it was an allegory, a mirror he deliberately raised to reflect the problems he saw in Athenian society. By placing Atlantis in a faraway land beyond the sea, he gave the tale an air of ancient distance, while also lifting it out of immediate reality, allowing him to discuss politics and morality without confronting his contemporaries directly. In Plato's philosophy, the ideal world is always set in contrast to the real one. Atlantis, as he described it, was first a political model that once held balance, then gradually decayed as moral values eroded. It was the image of a nation that had been given every advantage but allowed power and pride to pull it away from its natural order. When ambition grew unchecked and ethics were replaced by expansionism, they brought about their own destruction. This theme is familiar across Plato's work. He often warned that any society that loses moderation ultimately loses itself. Thus, Atlantis was never a story about a literal place. It was a political lesson, dressed in mythic clothing. And Plato's true target was Athens itself. He wrote Timaeus and Critias after Athens had endured profound turmoil, war, power struggles, and a collapse of the values he believed once defined its strength. By describing a distant nation that rose to glory and then fell through corruption, he reminded Athens that even a city founded on high ideals could fall apart if it abandoned its moral center. In this sense, Atlantis was a metaphor for an Athens that had lost its equilibrium, a society whose core values were being overshadowed by ambition and the pursuit of dominance. The irony is that this philosophical layer, the very heart of Plato's message, is the part modern audiences most often overlook. When writers of the 19th century and beyond reinterpreted Atlantis, they shifted their attention toward the fantastical, sunken temples, advanced technology, lost continents, and blurred the most important meaning of the story. Popular culture became captivated by the idea of a forgotten super-civilization, rather than a moral parable. While Plato used Atlantis to warn against the corruption of power, modern readers went searching for a perfect world that vanished or an archaeological secret waiting to be uncovered. The reason for this shift lies in human desire itself. A philosophical lesson rarely excites people as much as a legend about a drowned continent. People want to believe in miracles, in ancient technologies, in secrets hidden beneath the sea, because these ideas evoke wonder. But by focusing on the extraordinary, they unintentionally ignore the reason Plato told the story in the first place: to remind us that any civilization, no matter how strong, can fall if it forgets its ethical foundation. When we read Atlantis in this spirit, the story becomes far closer to reality. It is no longer a quest to locate a missing land, but a lesson about humanity, about the fragility of social systems, and about our ability to lose ourselves when swept up by ambition. In this deeper meaning, Atlantis is neither remote nor mystical. It is present in the way every civilization, in every age, must face the same question: can we preserve the values that once made us strong? When we see Atlantis as an allegory woven together with fragments of real memory, it becomes easier to understand why so many groups of scholars have tried to identify the places that may have contributed to the story, not to prove that Atlantis existed as a lost supercontinent, but to determine which landscapes and which vanished coastal cultures might have blended together, transformed through centuries of retelling, and eventually crystallized into Plato's account. Within that search, the Mediterranean emerges as the most examined region, because it is here that seafaring civilizations once thrived, where violent geological events reshaped coastlines, and where historical fractures were dramatic enough to leave traces in myth. These locations are not meant to replace one another. They are fragments of a larger mosaic that may have inspired the image we now call Atlantis. Crete, home of the Minoan civilization, is often viewed as the most prominent candidate. Nowhere else in the Mediterranean so clearly combined maritime trade, palace architecture, and naval strength during its peak. The island once stood at the center of Aegean power, where palaces like Knossos rose like self-contained cities, complete with storerooms, ceremonial courts, and brightly decorated walls. Crete was also one of the regions most severely affected by the Thera eruption, giving its decline a kind of tragic clarity that could easily have survived in collective memory. When Plato described a prosperous nation that later fell because of the sea, Crete was the most plausible real-world reflection of that idea. Santorini, the volcanic ring that once held the eruptive heart of Thera, is the second major candidate, and a perfect complement to Crete. The ancient circular shape of Santorini's landscape is the very feature that led many to believe Plato may have heard a distant echo of this island before it exploded. The red, black, and white stones he mentioned match the natural palette of Santorini's volcanic rock. With its catastrophic eruption that wiped out large portions of Aegean life, Santorini became a symbol of what ancient people could only understand as a land sinking into the sea, a flourishing world erased in a single brutal moment. Cyprus, though not as central in modern discussions as Crete or Santorini, offers its own compelling example. an island with urban centers, vigorous trade, a rich cultural tapestry, and a life inseparable from the sea. Cyprus played a crucial role in Eastern Mediterranean exchange networks, hosting cities that rose and fell under the weight of war, earthquakes, and shifting climate. These cycles of disruption could easily have merged into the broader memory that Plato inherited, capturing the fragility of coastal power centers. Farther west, Sicily and Malta bring yet another dimension to the story. Malta stands out especially for possessing the oldest stone temples in Europe, structures that predate even the Egyptian pyramids. Temples like Gantija and Hagar Kim reveal a complex, ritual-oriented society with a surprising level of organization for its time. Yet the region was repeatedly shaken by earthquakes and undersea landslides, creating local legends of land swallowed by the sea. Smaller in scale than the Minoans, but older in origin, Malta may have contributed to the mythic memory of ancient societies that vanished without leaving their own written stories behind. Finally, southern Iberia and the Gulf of Cadiz add another intriguing piece to the puzzle, tied to archaeological remains that have sparked significant debate. This area contains coastal marshlands and traces of circular structures buried beneath layers of mud, features that led some researchers to propose that a concentric city might once have existed here. While these interpretations remain controversial, the region undeniably contains evidence of settlements destroyed by floods, overtaken by the sea, or buried under sediment. Such events mirror the same patterns seen throughout the Mediterranean, and in oral traditions, losses like these could easily have merged into a single shared image of a prosperous land that disappeared. When we view all these candidate regions as slices of one larger narrative, Atlantis no longer needs to correspond to a single point on a map. It becomes a fusion of memories, the prosperity of Crete, the circular form of ancient Santorini, the maritime networks of Cyprus, the antiquity of Malta, and the vanished settlements of southern Iberia. Together, they form a symbolic landscape, not fixed in geography, but living in the memories of people who witnessed the earth reshape itself and tried to describe those changes in the language and imagination of their time. Among the places once mentioned as Atlantis candidates, the wetlands of Doñana in southern Spain have sparked some of the most intense debate in modern archaeology. Not because they hide monumental structures or relics beyond their time, but because they preserve a strange pattern of landforms and a series of disaster markers that align with what ancient people might have remembered. Beneath layers of mud accumulated over thousands of years, researchers have identified concentric circles and interwoven shapes, patterns strikingly similar to the circular city described in Plato's account. While no one can say with certainty that these are the remains of a major city, the fact that these circles lie deep under ancient sediment has led many to believe the area was once a significant settlement, later buried entirely by a catastrophic event. Doñana sits on a vast marsh near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, a crossroads where Mediterranean coastal communities once traded with the Iberian interior. Surveys using ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging have revealed massive circular formations, along with straight and curved features hidden beneath thick mud. Some theories suggest these might be remnants of a settlement with walls or water control structures, circular layouts that were common in many ancient cultures for managing irrigation and trade. Although the true purpose of these patterns remains uncertain, they are unusual enough to raise a compelling question. What kind of event buried this entire landscape so deeply that it now survives only as pale outlines beneath the ground? The answer may lie in the natural environment itself. Doñana stands at the edge of the Atlantic, where salt water and fresh water meet, and where storms, floods, and shifting river channels have shaped the land for thousands of years. Ancient sediment layers show clear evidence of massive floods sweeping across the region, possibly during periods of climatic instability after the end of the Ice Age, or during centuries of extreme weather. These thick layers of mud, mixed with marine sand and river deposits, point to a major catastrophe. Water surging through the land, stripping away everything in its path, and leaving behind fragments of structures blurred and buried. For the people who lived here, such a flood would have been nothing short of destruction, and when retold through generations, it could easily have transformed into a story about a brilliant city swallowed by the sea. Many archaeologists and geographers see Doñana as one of the closest real-world matches to Atlantis, precisely because of two elements: the circular formations beneath the ground and the evidence of catastrophic flooding. These two features echo the most iconic images in Plato's description: the concentric city and its sudden annihilation by water. Some researchers argue that if the memory of a once thriving coastal trading hub, later erased by a great ancient flood, was passed from the Phoenicians to the Iberians and then to the Egyptians, it could have become the story Solon heard, and the story Plato eventually wrote down. Yet the fact that Doñana is an intriguing candidate does not automatically make it the real Atlantis. The structures found beneath the mud could be interpreted in many ways, and equating them with a mighty lost civilization may reflect a desire for answers more than firm evidence. Even so, the hints found here make the region an important link in the long chain of searching for the origins of the legend. They show that somewhere along the wider Mediterranean world, coastal centers of trade could indeed be destroyed by storms and floods, leaving behind only faint circular traces, a blurred manuscript that modern researchers are trying to read before time erases it completely. In that sense, Doñana does not need to be Atlantis, but it does stand as proof that stories of land swallowed by the sea may have begun with events that were entirely real: devastating floods, geological shifts, and settlements that vanished, leaving only fragile marks beneath the mud. These are the very images that allowed the Atlantis legend to endure, not because they belong to fantasy, but because they echo what ancient cultures had once seen with their own eyes. When people explore the many theories about Atlantis, it's easy for the modern imagination to drift toward the Atlantic Ocean, a vast, misty, mysterious expanse that seemed almost untouched by the ancient world. Yet when examined through the lens of science and archaeology, the Atlantic quickly becomes one of the least convincing candidates. Its allure comes from the romantic pull of the open sea and the desire to place a lost world somewhere distant and dramatic. But the evidence tells a very different story. Once we lay all the data on the table, it becomes clear that Atlantis is unlikely to have been anywhere in the Atlantic, either in terms of geography or in the spirit of the story Plato intended to tell. The first issue is the complete absence of any major civilization in the Atlantic during the era Plato described. The large islands we know today, such as the Azores, Madeira, or the Canary Islands, while beautiful, show no signs of ancient cities, advanced societies, or any complex infrastructure that could resemble a thriving maritime empire. There are no buildings, no tools, no artifacts pointing to a culture that might match the scale or sophistication of the Mediterranean civilizations. More importantly, many of these islands were not even inhabited until thousands of years after the time frame Plato referenced. The lack of archaeological traces makes it nearly impossible for the Atlantic to be the home of Atlantis, no matter how often modern imagination tries to place it there. Another reason people often believe Atlantis lies somewhere in the Atlantic is the idea of a sunken supercontinent, a large landmass that supposedly existed and then disappeared without a trace. But geological science has long disproven this. No continental-sized landmass has ever sunk beneath the Atlantic Ocean in the last tens of thousands of years. Continents do not simply fall into the sea because of earthquakes or natural disasters. Such a change would require tectonic forces on a scale far beyond anything possible during human history. The floor of the Atlantic also reveals no signs of submerged ancient architecture, no foundations, no artificial geological shapes. Even the underwater ridges and plateaus of the Atlantic are the products of oceanic crust formation, not remnants of a lost civilization. Once the layers of popular imagination are removed, what remains is simply an ocean, deep, wide, and geologically ordinary. A major misunderstanding that fueled Atlantic-based theories comes from Plato's phrase, "beyond the Pillars of Hercules." Many modern readers assume this must mean west of Gibraltar, pointing directly toward the Atlantic. But in ancient Greek culture, the Pillars of Hercules did not always refer to a fixed location. The phrase was used flexibly to mark perceived boundaries of the known world, sometimes referring to points inside the Mediterranean, sometimes to narrow straits, sometimes to symbolic limits rather than literal geography. Linguists and historians have shown that centuries of mistranslation and reinterpretation pushed Atlantis farther west than Plato ever intended, distancing it from the Mediterranean environment that shaped the story. It is also important to remember that Plato never described Atlantis as a gigantic continent stretching for thousands of miles. He described it as a large island, powerful, wealthy, and influential, but not a sprawling landmass. When modern culture placed Atlantis into the Atlantic, it enlarged and exaggerated the idea, making it something Plato never wrote. This shift added layers of drama, but removed the story from the world Plato actually knew. A world of islands, seaways, earthquakes, and volcanic forces that genuinely did shape the fate of ancient peoples. Taken together, the Atlantic does not offer archaeological, geological, or cultural support for Atlantis. Its appeal comes from mystery, not from evidence. And when we return to the story as Plato intended it, grounded in the Mediterranean, shaped by real civilizations, and framed by natural disasters, Atlantis becomes clearer, closer, and far more human. It belongs to a world where people lived beside restless seas and trembling earth, and where a single shift in nature could erase everything they had built. For centuries, sensational theories about Atlantis, from continents sinking overnight to colossal artificial structures hidden thousands of meters beneath the ocean, have captured the public imagination. But when these ideas are examined through the lens of geological science, the picture becomes much clearer. Most of them are impossible under any natural process the Earth is capable of. Geology, which operates under slow but consistent rules, simply does not allow for the sudden, dramatic transformations that mythical stories often describe. And it is exactly these rules that help us separate what is plausible from what is a product of exaggeration or misunderstanding. The first point geology makes unmistakably clear is that continents cannot sink into the sea because of an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, or any single disaster. Tectonic plates, the massive structures that support continents, move at a rate measured in centimeters per year, and they cannot collapse vertically into the ocean. Land can gradually subside. It can be eroded by the sea over long periods of time, or it can be devastated by tsunamis, but it cannot vanish as if pulled downward into the deep. Even the most violent disasters in human history, such as the Thera eruption or the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, caused only localized subsidence or forced seawater far inland. They did not, and could not, swallow an entire landmass. Stories of Atlantis disappearing in a single night, therefore, reflect the emotional impact of natural disasters on ancient people, rather than the actual geological mechanisms of the Earth. At the same time, many modern theories rely on unusual shapes on the seafloor to suggest the existence of artificial stone foundations dating back 12,000 years. But when examined through geological and archaeological methods, these formations consistently reveal natural origins. The well-known steps, walls, or underwater pyramids, often featured in popular media, are products of natural weathering, fracturing, or erosion. In many places, basalt or sandstone eroded by seawater forms flat surfaces or block-like shapes that easily fool the human eye into seeing architecture. When measured carefully, none of these structures show signs of carving, cutting, or intentional arrangement. And more importantly, there are no accompanying cultural artifacts, no tools, no pottery, no human-made materials, which would be required to confirm an ancient settlement. The idea of a 12,000-year-old foundation beneath the sea is therefore built more on speculation than on evidence. Another source of confusion comes from misunderstandings about how rock ages are measured, a mistake that spreads easily when information is condensed or misinterpreted in the media. Geology draws a sharp distinction between the age of the rock itself and the age of any human activity on it. A stone may be millions of years old, but that does not mean a structure on top of it is the same age. Many people hear that the rock here is 12,000 years old and mistakenly assume the human structure must be that old as well. In archaeology, the age of the bedrock and the age of human construction are two entirely different things, and failing to distinguish between them has led to many unrealistic claims. A number of so-called ancient discoveries were simply geological age measurements rather than cultural ones, causing the public to fall into baseless speculation. When all these factors are brought together, geology becomes a compass, guiding discussions that might otherwise drift towards sensational ideas. The Earth's processes, though slower and less dramatic than mythical narratives, form the most reliable foundation for understanding the past. Instead of a supernatural sunken continent, geology points us towards something far more grounded: eruptions, ancient floods, shifting coastlines, and the disappearance of coastal communities. And it is these real, powerful, and often devastating events, not the sensational theories, that truly lie behind legends like Atlantis. As the philosophical layers and geographic hints in Plato's original writings faded over time, the story of Atlantis began a new journey, one driven not by ancient memory, but by the imagination of the people who inherited it. The legend drifted away from the Mediterranean, away from the intellectual spirit of classical Greece, and entered the broader cultural landscape of the Western world. In each era, Atlantis was reinterpreted to meet the spiritual needs of the time, sometimes as a moral lesson, sometimes as evidence of a forgotten world, and later as raw material for grand narratives in popular culture. The irony is that no period ever preserved Plato's original intent. Instead, every age created its own version of Atlantis, shaped by its anxieties, dreams, and desires. During the Middle Ages, when Europe was still deeply shaped by religious thinking and theological storytelling, Atlantis was never treated as a site to be excavated or a natural mystery to be solved. It was read as a moral parable, an ancient example illustrating arrogance and divine punishment. Scholars of that era, guided by religious frameworks, saw the fall of Atlantis as a reminder that any society drifting away from virtue would eventually pay the price. No one searched for Atlantis on a map. They searched for ethical meaning within the story. In that period, the legend wasn't an object of investigation, but a teaching tool, an allegory reinforcing the belief that human beings must live within a divinely ordered world. Atlantis, this faraway land, became a mirror for the downfall of those who grew too proud. But by the 19th century, as Europe entered an age of spiritual revival, speculative science, and occult fascination, Atlantis was reborn in an entirely different form. This was the era when esoteric movements and mystical philosophies flourished, especially within organizations like Theosophy. Figures such as Helena Blavatsky treated Atlantis not as a metaphor or a historical echo, but as a superior civilization that existed before modern humanity. They attributed to it mystical qualities, advanced technology, heightened mental powers, and knowledge far beyond its time. None of this came from Plato or archaeology, but it matched the spirit of an era enchanted by the possibility of ancient, hidden wisdom. Atlantis became a symbol of the lost world, both mysterious and exalted, a perfect foundation for esoteric theories to root themselves in. From there, it's easy to see why, in the modern era, Atlantis was pushed even further by popular culture. As film, science fiction, and mass media rose to prominence, Atlantis became the perfect backdrop for adventure. Crystal cities beneath the sea, alien technologies, undiscovered secrets waiting in the deep. Its appeal no longer came from plausibility, but from entertainment value. From animated films and video games to television documentaries and sensational headlines, Atlantis was transformed into a world larger than imagination, completely disconnected from the philosophical, geological, or historical context it once carried. Each retelling amplified the legend a little more, then a little more again, until the Atlantis of modern culture barely resembled the story Plato wrote. What links all these eras is a simple truth. People have always wanted Atlantis to serve the needs of their own time. In the Middle Ages, it served moral teaching. In the 19th century, it served the hunger for higher knowledge. In the modern age, it serves the desire for mystery and spectacle. And in the process, the original meaning, an allegory about moral decline and the fragility of human societies, grew dim beneath new layers of imagination. The legend survived, but it survived in shapes each era created for itself. When we step away from cultural reinterpretations and return to the natural landscape of the distant past, we encounter a truth heavier than any legend. The shadow of the Ice Age still lies across humanity's collective memory. This was a time when the Earth was not only colder, but shaped by a geography entirely different from the one we know today. These slow, thousand-year transformations reshaped coastlines, erased fertile valleys, and turned many of humanity's earliest homelands into the seafloors of the modern world. It was a shift ancient people could not explain scientifically, but they could feel it, and those feelings became the raw material for countless stories of vanished lands, with Atlantis being only one peak rising above a much larger landscape of memory. At the end of the Ice Age, as massive glaciers melted away, global sea levels rose by roughly 120 meters. That number may seem like a dry geological statistic, but once imagined in daily life, it becomes clear just how powerful a transformation it was. Entire river valleys once inhabited by human communities sank underwater. Vast plains that supported prehistoric life disappeared beneath rising seas. Ancient coastlines became today's continental shelves. Places that were once fertile fields, where early humans hunted, gathered, and eventually settled, now lie dozens of meters below the surface. If any early cultures emerged there, most of their traces were washed away or buried deep beneath layers of marine sediment. And it was not only individual regions that vanished, entire river systems were reshaped. Rivers that once flowed across broad valleys now empty into bays, inlets, or inland seas. Lowland regions that once served as trade hubs or migration corridors are now shallow ocean floors. To ancient people watching the shoreline draw closer to their homes, their boats, their fields, their shelters. There was no way to understand they were witnessing a global climatic shift. To them, it simply felt like the sea was swallowing the world. Passed down through generations, that feeling naturally evolved into stories of lands taken by the ocean. This is also why so many ancient homelands seem to have left no trace. It is not because they never existed. It is because they now lie in places archaeology still struggles to reach. Even with modern technology, much of the ancient continental shelf remains buried under thick layers of sediment. Prehistoric sites that once sat on dry ground are now entangled in mud, sand, coral, or lost to underwater landslides. The absence of evidence does not mean the absence of truth. It only shows the limits of what we can currently see. Through this lens, Atlantis is not an anomaly. It becomes one memory among many of lost lands. When Plato described an island swallowed by the sea, he did not need to invoke a supernatural continent. He was drawing from an emotional reality ancient people knew intimately. The experience of standing on the shore and watching the ocean advance, of losing land that ancestors had called home for generations. The shadow of the Ice Age stretches so far across human memory that many myths of great floods, vanished coastlines, and drowned worlds may trace their origins back to these slow, relentless changes. And that reveals something essential. Atlantis never needed to be a mysterious super-civilization to endure in humanity's imagination. It may simply be the way ancient people explained losses they could not understand, a story preserved to mourn the lands that slipped quietly beneath the rising seas. When we look back at the powerful changes that followed the end of the Ice Age and the geological shifts that continued across history, it becomes easy to understand why the ancient world left behind so many lost lands, cities that once thrived and then slipped beneath the sea without leaving a written trace. These places are not products of myth. They are clear evidence that a city can disappear underwater without any supernatural cause. And as we examine each case, it becomes apparent that the memory of Atlantis stands far from alone. It is simply one chapter in a long story that nature has written across both the surface and the seafloors of the earth. Pavlopetri, off the coast of Greece, is one of the most striking examples. This city existed around 5,000 years ago and is considered one of the oldest underwater urban settlements ever discovered. When mapped using seafloor scanning technology, Pavlopetri revealed carefully planned streets, rectangular buildings, room complexes, and small trade routes. These features show that it was not a temporary settlement, but a structured community with commerce and social life. The city did not vanish through a sudden catastrophe, but through a long process of land subsidence, shifting sea levels, and repeated earthquakes over thousands of years. This slow transformation preserved the site beneath shallow water, turning it into a rare window into the distant past. Baiae in Italy tells a very different story, but one equally vivid. Once a luxurious resort for the Roman elite, filled with villas, thermal baths, entertainment halls, and refined architecture, large parts of it now lie underwater. Volcanic activity in the Bay of Naples caused the ground to gradually sink, pulling entire districts below sea level. When archaeologists discovered Roman roads, mosaics, and villas beneath the waves, it became another reminder that even the most prosperous cities can be surrendered to the sea, not in a moment of drama, but through the quiet, relentless rhythm of geological change. Baiae was not lost to myth. It was lost to the natural motion of the earth, a fate that brings it very close to stories like Atlantis. Thriving places eventually return to the water without leaving behind complete answers. Ancient Alexandria in Egypt offers another image of loss. Most people remember the city for the great library, but few recall that a significant portion of Alexandria collapsed into the sea after powerful earthquakes roughly 2,000 years ago. When archaeologists dove along the city's harbor, they found massive stone columns, statues of pharaohs, broken architectural blocks, and the remains of buildings once belonging to the royal quarter. This disappearance was not due to waves alone, but to the violent movements of the Earth's crust. Alexandria, in that sense, was not erased by legend, but by geological silence, a silence that forces later generations to piece together history from fragments scattered across the seafloor. Dwarka on the coast of India, although unrelated directly to Atlantis or the Mediterranean, provides a powerful example of the vulnerability of coastal civilizations. Underwater remains here reveal walls, streets, and stone structures lying deep below the surface. While Dwarka is spoken of in Hindu tradition with a mythic tone, underwater archaeology confirms that ancient settlements once stood in areas now submerged. Shifting currents, major storms, and rising sea levels gradually erased much of the region. What makes Dwarka valuable is not its connection to Atlantis, but how clearly it demonstrates that cities can vanish beneath the sea through entirely natural processes, leaving only scattered ruins for future generations. When we look at all these sunken cities together, one truth becomes clear. Atlantis is not a singular exception, nor an outlandish idea. It belongs to a long chain of real stories the world has witnessed, communities that grew beside the sea, prospered because of it, and were eventually reclaimed by it through natural shifts. Pavlopetri, Baiae, Alexandria, and Dwarka are not myths, they are reality. And that reality highlights what Plato expressed through allegory, that human worlds are far more fragile than we imagine, and lands that seem everlasting can disappear from the map through changes so gradual we barely perceive them until they are gone. When we look at all the sunken cities, the lost lands, and the geological memories that drift through time, we begin to see a more subtle truth hidden beneath the Atlantis legend. The story is reflective. It is not the imprint of one single place, but a mirror made of countless fragments of memory from coastal communities, each culture contributing its own sense of loss to the myth. This reflective quality is what makes Atlantis feel both familiar and distant, rooted in the Mediterranean, yet able to take shape in the imagination of any culture that has ever lived beside the sea and faced forces beyond its control. In reality, if we widen the lens, every region has its own Atlantis, a story about a flourishing land taken by the sea, a tale preserved in oral memory about a place once seen as the heart of life. In India, it is Dwarka. In Japan, Yonaguni. In Britain, Doggerland, the vast plain that once connected the British Isles to Europe, now lying beneath the North Sea. In Southeast Asia, the legends of Sundaland speak of ancient terraces of land drowned 10,000 years ago. Each place carries its own stories. Each holds its own collective memory of lands lost to rising water. When these stories are placed side by side, Atlantis no longer stands alone. It becomes a universal symbol of humanity's shared experience, the experience of losing a homeland with no power to bring it back. Among ancient coastal communities, people told these stories of loss through myth, not because they lacked understanding, but because myth was the most powerful way to preserve an event beyond explanation or record. When nature acted, when the sea rose, when earthquakes struck, when coastlines collapsed, ancient people had no language for tectonic plates or climate change. What they had were stories, and those stories had to be strong enough to survive time, vivid enough for the next generation to remember, symbolic enough not to fade. The events they witnessed were transformed into images of divine punishment, of kingdoms swallowed for their pride, or of radiant lands disappearing in an instant. Myth became their way of humanizing nature, of giving shape to fear, meaning to loss, and coherence to a world they could not fully understand. As real memories of natural disasters blended with oral tradition, they were shaped further by philosophical interpretation, especially in the case of Plato. He did not treat the tale as a historical report. He used it as a foundation for arguments about morality, power, and the decline of societies. Atlantis became the result of three intertwined currents: true memories of lost lands, the natural disasters that caused them, and the philosophical lens through which humans interpreted these events. None of these currents existed alone. They layered over one another like geological strata, forming the story we know today. It is this blending that makes Atlantis a reflective legend, a story in which any culture can see itself. It is not a fixed point on a map, but a symbol of what humanity has always faced: the fragility of civilization, the powerlessness before nature, and the need to find meaning in events that exceed human understanding. As the story passed from one generation to the next, old memories fused with new interpretations, and Atlantis became a mirror reflecting the fears and longings of different ages, never fixed, always shifting, yet somehow endlessly familiar. When we trace the origins of the story Plato recorded, we find a journey far quieter and far longer than most people imagine, a journey in which the memory of a real event may have drifted through several cultures before reaching him. Plato did not invent Atlantis out of thin air. He wrote that the story came to him through Solon, one of the 7 sages of Greece, and Solon heard it from the Egyptian priests at the city of Sais. That layered path allowed Atlantis to carry a kind of memory deeper than anything written text could hold, a memory belonging not to Greece alone, not to Egypt alone, but to generations of people who kept the story alive before it ever reached Plato's hands. The Egyptians, with their long tradition of recording history and their temple systems dedicated to preserving knowledge, were the perfect place for the oldest stories of the Mediterranean to gather. They documented the rise and fall of the Nile, but they also absorbed and safeguarded the stories of neighboring peoples. When Solon traveled to Sais to study history and law, the priests told him that the Greeks were young in the memory of humankind, and that before their time, great catastrophes had erased entire regions. The tale of a powerful island nation destroyed by nature was shared as a reminder of what history had witnessed, events that Egypt, shaped by Nile floods and shifting climate, understood better than anyone. But Egypt was not the birthplace of that memory. It was simply the keeper of it. The priests of Sais likely heard the story from Aegean peoples, those who lived under the direct impact of the Thera eruption and the decline of the Minoan civilization. Through merchants, sailors, or refugees, the memory of that eruption may have reached Egypt, told as a colossal event that reshaped the entire sea. During centuries of trade between the Aegean and the Nile Delta, it is no surprise that tales of loss traveled alongside goods. A disaster as large as Thera, with ash drifting as far as Egypt and climate effects lasting for years, would have left a mark on the collective memory of the Mediterranean. And as that memory passed through generations, its fragments may have fused into the story of a brilliant civilization taken by the sea. As for the Minoan memory, the lived experience of people on Crete and the Aegean islands, it did not survive only through the ruins we excavate today. It once lived in their voices. Survivors of the Thera disaster, though without a written record, carried their stories through trade, diplomacy, and migration. By the time their memories reached Egypt, they had already changed, reshaped by language, culture, and worldview. When Solon heard the story, he filtered it through Greek thought. When Plato wrote it down, he filtered it again. this time through philosophy. That multi-layered journey is what gives Atlantis its dreamlike quality, half real, half imagined. Plato may indeed have heard a story rooted in truth, not about a supernatural empire, but about a civilization that once existed and suffered a natural disaster no one at the time could fully understand. Those memories, carried across so many generations, inevitably shifted. Yet through all the shifts, a core remained. There was once a prosperous place, there was once a great upheaval, and humans, in every era, try to preserve the memory of what they have lost. Seen in this light, Atlantis becomes far less mysterious. It is simply an ancient memory, retold through generations, reinterpreted through different worldviews, and finally placed onto the page by Plato as a lesson about humanity. The Minoans may be part of that memory, the Thera eruption another part, and the rest shaped by Plato's philosophical purpose. Atlantis does not need to be a real place. It is the wandering of memory across time, eroded in some parts, illuminated in others, carried by humanity's enduring need to understand its own past. When we look at the long journey Atlantis has taken through human imagination, it becomes clear that its endurance is not simply about the story itself, but about something far deeper within us. It is no accident that among countless legends of lost lands, Atlantis is the one we return to again and again. It touches psychological layers that run quietly beneath every age, our desires, our fears, and our hopes. And it is the intersection of natural memory, philosophical interpretation, and collective psychology that makes Atlantis one of the most resilient symbols humanity has ever created. At its deepest level, the desire for Atlantis to be real reflects a shared psychological tendency. We want to believe the world still holds mysteries. In a modern era where almost everything seems charted, measured, and explained, Atlantis represents the remainder, the space of the unknown. It offers the possibility that history is not yet complete, that there are still great stories hidden under the water, waiting to be rediscovered. That longing is so strong that many people lean toward romantic theories, even when science provides no support. Sometimes, the need to believe in something extraordinary is stronger than the need to accept quiet truth. A layer deeper, Atlantis speaks to humanity's longing for a primordial perfection, a civilization imagined as peaceful, prosperous, harmonious, and wise in ways our modern world is not. This idea appears everywhere. India has the Satya Yuga. Greece has the Golden Age. Many cultures imagine an Eden-like beginning. In modern imagination, Atlantis is often folded into that pattern, as if it were the pure world before corruption, the shining model of what humanity once was. Yet Plato never described Atlantis that way. The idealization comes entirely from us. It says more about humanity's yearning than about Atlantis itself. We look backward to an idealized past because it gives us comfort and hope for the future. Layered on top of that is the enduring, lost world fantasy, our attraction to forgotten realms filled with ancient knowledge, buried splendor, or untouched mystery. Lost worlds appear in myth, in literature, in movies, in science fiction. They are the places where imagination grows without limits, unbound by geology, history, or logic. Atlantis, because it is both vague and vivid, real and unreal, becomes a perfect canvas for this kind of dreaming. Each era paints its own version onto that canvas. Crystal cities, forgotten technologies, mystical wisdom, or spiritual treasure. None of these come from Plato. They come from the human need to imagine what lies beyond the visible. What is most striking is that these three forces, collective psychology, the longing for a perfect beginning, and the lost world fantasy, do not exist separately. They merge into one current, feeding the myth again and again. Even when science shows that much of the legend cannot be literal, people still want Atlantis to be true. Not because of archaeology, but because Atlantis represents possibility. The possibility that something vast remains unseen, that the past held a beauty we lost, and that a hidden world might someday rise again into our understanding. In this sense, Atlantis survives not because of evidence, but because of desire. It is sustained not by ruins, but by the quiet, persistent human hope that history still holds secrets waiting to be uncovered. And in that meeting point, between what is real, what is remembered, and what we long for, Atlantis becomes both a myth and a mirror, reflecting human nature across every age. As we continue tracing Atlantis through the shifting space between memory and science, we eventually confront a quiet but crucial truth. What we know about the ancient world is only the smallest visible fragment of everything humanity once built. Archaeology, despite its remarkable advances, still operates within boundaries we cannot easily break. And it is within these boundaries that legends like Atlantis survive, living in the space between what has been proven and what remains beyond reach. When we look at the numbers, those gaps become so vast that they remind us the silence of history does not mean nothing existed. Sometimes, it only means we have not yet reached the places where the story is kept. The most important fact is this: roughly 70% of humanity's heritage lies beneath the sea. And that number does not simply refer to shipwrecks or drowned harbors. It includes the entire sweep of coastal settlements that existed before sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. Villages, harbors, marketplaces, sometimes even full towns could vanish when the oceans rose more than 100 meters. Much of today's shallow continental shelves were once fields, river valleys, and shorelines. But sediment, strong currents, and the difficulty of underwater exploration have buried most traces of those early worlds. Our gaps in knowledge are not merely the result of time, they are the result of geography, of stories resting in places we still cannot reach. At the same time, underwater archaeology is still in its infancy compared to land-based excavation. In just the last few decades, sonar mapping, underwater drones, and 3D seabed imaging have opened their first small windows into the deep. But compared to the size of the oceans, our surveyed areas are little more than scattered dots. Excavating underwater is slow, complex, and delicate. Strong currents, low visibility, shifting sediment, and the sheer pressure of deep water make exploration far more difficult than digging on land. Many promising areas lie too deep for divers, and robotic expeditions are expensive and technically demanding. This means that major pieces of history, fragments capable of reshaping our understanding of the ancient world, may simply still be waiting, silent, and untouched. And within those limits, the possibility of future discoveries becomes essential. Each technological leap extends the reach of history itself. The uncovering of Pavlopetri, the submerged districts of Alexandria, and the underwater structures of Dwarka all happened because tools improved just enough to reveal what once seemed impossible. If those advances continue, there is no reason to think the Mediterranean shelf or the coastlines of ancient worlds hold no further secrets. Over the next decade, as seabed scanning grows sharper and underwater robotics more agile, we may finally access areas that remain invisible today. For now, the greatest boundary in archaeology is not lack of knowledge, it's lack of access. The places that hold humanity's missing chapters may be drowned plains, collapsed harbors, or quiet coastal towns that never made it into written history. And it is precisely within those silent spaces that legends like Atlantis continue to survive, not as fantasies, but as reminders that entire cultures, entire events, entire worlds may still be hidden just beyond our reach. But if archaeology continues to progress, these long silences may gradually fade. And when that happens, the old memories preserved in myth may finally find their true places, not in the realm of the mysterious, but within the quiet layers of sediment resting beneath the sea, where time has been writing its story all along. Even after tracing Atlantis through geology, archaeology, history, and the psychology of collective memory, one thing becomes unmistakably clear. Beneath all the layers of interpretation, this legend did not emerge from a blank space in human imagination. It carries strands of something real, threads woven through thousands of years of memory and gathered by Plato into a philosophical framework. And when we peel those layers back, three things stand firmer than anything else. The three most certain truths about Atlantis. First, the story of Atlantis begins with a real catastrophe. No supernatural force is needed, only the natural history of the Mediterranean. When we look at this region, we see disasters powerful enough to leave marks across generations. The eruption of Thera is one of the strongest candidates, an explosion dozens of times greater than Krakatoa, producing tsunamis, ash-darkened skies, and tremors felt across the entire Aegean. Its effects lasted for years, crippling trade networks and reshaping coastlines. To ancient people witnessing this, the memory of a flourishing land, swallowed by the sea, in a single day and night, would have felt absolutely true. Not geologically literal, but emotionally accurate. This disaster, or events like it throughout the Mediterranean, forms the first anchor of Atlantis. Not pure myth, but a reflection of real natural upheaval. Second, the Atlantis narrative echoes a real civilization, not a super-civilization, but a thriving coastal society with trade, art, architecture, and regional influence. The Minoans of Crete are the closest match, a sophisticated maritime culture with intricate palaces, vibrant frescoes, and a commanding presence across the Aegean. Their decline after the Thera eruption was not instantaneous, but it was sudden enough to leave a lasting cultural scar. And even though Plato never names them, many elements of his description mirror Minoan life: wealth, power, location, urban complexity, and a dramatic fall. This suggests that Atlantis did not sprout from pure invention. It grew from memories of ancient maritime cultures that disappeared more quickly than their stories did. Finally, the most certain truth about Atlantis is this: the version we know was shaped through the philosophical lens of Plato. This is the part modern audiences often forget while searching for a geographic location. In Timaeus and Critias, Plato was not writing history, he was crafting philosophy. Atlantis was his vehicle for exploring moral decline, civic imbalance, and the dangers of unchecked ambition. When he describes Atlantis as a nation strong at first, then corrupted by pride, he is presenting a model, a warning aimed squarely at Athens. The story was not meant to be a map, it was meant to be a metaphor, a lesson about how even the greatest societies collapse when they abandon their ethical foundations. So while the roots of the tale may lie in real disasters and real cultures, the shape we inherit today is molded almost entirely by Plato's philosophical intent. Viewed through these three anchors, Atlantis becomes something rare, yet entirely coherent. It is neither fully real nor fully imaginary. It is born from real catastrophes, reflected through a real civilization, and retold as a philosophical narrative, stretched, compressed, or dramatized to serve the argument Plato wished to make. And that is why Atlantis endures. It has just enough truth to avoid being dismissed, and just enough symbolism to transcend the limits of literal history. It is memory and lesson and mirror, reflecting humanity across every era that retells it. When we look at the journey of Atlantis as a reflection of lost lands, what we discover does not belong only to the past. Those ancient fragments of memory, those disasters once preserved through myth, now read like a very real warning for the modern world. Because even as technology advances, societies grow more complex, and science expands our understanding, we are still living in places shaped by the same forces that once erased entire civilizations. Coastlines, fault zones, volcanic arcs, and the shifting edge of a climate we cannot fully control. In that sense, Atlantis is not merely a story about an ancient world. It is a mirror held up to the present, reminding us that today's great cities live with the same vulnerabilities as those long gone. The first lesson Atlantis leaves us is the fragility of coastal cities. From the Minoans to Alexandria, from Pavlopetri to Dwarka, every society that thrived because of the sea eventually found itself threatened by that same sea. More than half of humanity today lives along coastlines, and some of our largest cities, New York, Shanghai, Tokyo, Mumbai, Jakarta, stand on land barely above modern sea level. Coastal cities carry an inherent contradiction. The wealthier and more interconnected they become, the more damage a single natural event can inflict. Ancient people could not resist the sea. Modern people have technology, but we face the same risks, only on a far larger scale. Atlantis, symbolic as it is, reminds us that no city is immune to the rhythms of nature. And the truth is this: rising seas, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions are not relics of the ancient world. They are happening now. Global sea levels continue to rise faster than at any time in thousands of years. Supervolcanoes like Santorini, Vesuvius, and Campi Flegrei are still active, carrying the potential to reshape entire regions. The fault lines beneath the Mediterranean continue to shift, producing earthquakes capable of collapsing cities just as they did long ago. If the Minoans could fall to natural forces, then today's coastal megacities face similar dangers. Despite all our modern knowledge, the power of nature still exceeds our ability to control it. When we place the ancient world beside the modern one, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Humanity repeats the same mistakes. Long ago, the great maritime cultures believed their strength would endure, that the sea would always support them, that their systems were strong enough to withstand anything. But nature does not bend to the logic of human power. The Minoans did not fall to an invading army. They fell to a natural event they could not anticipate. Ancient Alexandria did not sink because of war. It sank because the earth moved beneath it. Pavlopetri did not vanish due to conflict. It disappeared because land subsided and the sea advanced. Yet today, we continue building cities of tens of millions on the same vulnerable edges. Right at the waterline, on soft ground, near seismic zones. We expand outward, convinced we can manage every risk, forgetting that civilizations most often collapse, not from external threats, but from the assumption that they are untouchable. If Atlantis teaches a lesson, it is not about locating a missing continent. It is about how humanity confronts nature. Atlantis reminds us that what we build may be magnificent, but never invincible. Prosperity often breeds complacency, and complacency breeds vulnerability. The sea and the land are still shifting, just as they were in Plato's time. The real question is not where Atlantis was, but why it disappeared. And if we understand that, we begin to see more clearly. Atlantis is not only a story of what once was. It is a reminder for the present that every civilization stands on more fragile ground than it believes, and that our survival depends on learning the lessons nature tried to teach long before Plato ever wrote his tale. As we reach the final steps of this long journey, Atlantis no longer appears as a point on a map or a sunken city waiting to be discovered, but as something deeper, a symbol humanity uses to look at itself. After centuries of searching, excavating, and imagining, what is endured is not an archaeological trace, but the meaning behind the story. And when we place Atlantis back into the context Plato intended, we begin to see that the real question is not where it once existed, but what it says about people, about power, and about the limits we so often forget. First, Atlantis is a story about power, pride, and collapse. Plato never described it as a perfect civilization. He portrayed a society once strong, but corrupted by its own success. As its influence grew, as pride clouded its judgment, Atlantis believed it stood above all rules, that it could surpass the limits of nature and morality. That belief became its undoing. Plato's structure was not a historical map, but a moral model, a civilization that destroyed itself by chasing ambition without restraint. In this sense, Atlantis reminds us that prosperity is never immortal, and power is never a shield against the natural laws of the world. But Atlantis is more than a lesson in ethics. It is also a story people told to understand themselves, to explain events beyond their control, and to make sense of losses too immense for ordinary language. Ancient people saw the sea rise into their land, saw volcanoes erupt, saw earthquakes tear apart their cities, events they had no science to explain. They transformed these experiences into stories of pride punished, of islands swallowed overnight, of humanity made small before nature. Atlantis, at its core, was a way for ancient people to comfort themselves, to give meaning to a world that often acted without warning. And when Plato received the story, he reshaped it into a philosophical tool, something that could help people reflect on society, morality, and the delicate balance that holds civilizations together. Ultimately, Atlantis is where geology and imagination meet, a rare intersection between real memory, human perception, and the need to interpret the world. Geology provides the foundation: eruptions, tsunamis, land subsidence, rising seas, events that truly happened. Imagination provides the symbols: the concentric city, the radiant kingdom, the downfall in a single night. When the two intertwine, Atlantis becomes something no map can capture, a myth born from truth, but sustained by the human mind. It does not have to be found to hold value. It exists as a lens through which we understand natural history, cultural memory, and the boundaries of what humans can control. Seen as a metaphor, Atlantis reveals its true power, not as a place, but as a reflection of human nature across time. It shows that humanity always stands between two forces, nature and ambition, and that every civilization becomes fragile the moment it forgets the balance between them. Atlantis, in the end, is not a puzzle that needs solving. It is a mirror held up to everything people have lived through, and everything we may face again. As we arrive at the final edge of this long journey, Atlantis no longer appears as a destination waiting to be pinpointed, but as a quiet layer of memory drifting through different ages, an outline that shifts with human hopes, fears, and desires. And when we look back at its entire path, we see that Atlantis never truly sank in any absolute sense. It simply changed form. It moved into places more enduring than limestone or sediment, into memory, into symbol, into the ruins of lost coastlines, and into the lingering question that history has never been able to answer completely. In truth, Atlantis lives in countless ancient coastal cities, places that once flourished, then slipped beneath the water. Pavlopetri, Baiae, the old Alexandria, Dwarka, Doggerland, Sunderland. Each of these lands, scattered across the world, holds a fragment of Atlantis. The prosperity, the fragility, the disappearance. None of them is the real Atlantis, yet each is an Atlantis in the symbolic sense, a place taken by the sea before it had the chance to tell its full story. When we look at ruins lying quietly underwater, we can almost see Atlantis stretching along the shorelines of the world, not fixed, not singular, but spread like a network of submerged memories. Atlantis also lives in humanity's shared sense of loss, a deep, ancient ache carried from the moment people first stood at the edge of the sea and watched the horizon slowly retreat, watched the land disappear beneath rising water, watched places once called home become the floor of the ocean. This is not the memory of a single culture. It is a memory carried by all humanity, repeated across countless generations living beside the coast. When a place vanished, people told stories to keep it alive. And as those stories traveled farther, they folded into legend, then into symbol. Atlantis became the distilled essence of those losses, the longing for places that no longer stand on the map, but remain alive in the human mind. And finally, Atlantis survives in the question that never grows old. How quickly can history disappear? A city may take centuries to build, yet with one tremor, one towering wave, or one quiet shift in sea level, everything can vanish in a moment no one is prepared for. History doesn't sink through dramatic catastrophes the way legends describe. It sinks through silence, through thick layers of silt, through murky water, through archaeological gaps we have not yet reached. In that quiet space, Atlantis becomes an open question, whether what we know today is complete or merely the small visible crest of a much larger world beneath. And as we close this journey, we realize that Atlantis never truly vanished. It simply changed the way it exists. It is no longer the island of Plato, nor the mystical continent modern imaginations chase, but a soft reflection resting in the mind, a reminder that all civilizations are fragile, that human memory has limits, and that nature can redraw the map far faster than we expect. In this final breath, Atlantis settles like a gentle echo, low, soft, and calm. Not an ending, but a thin mist drifting across the listener's thoughts, like a wave that touches the shore and fades, leaving behind the familiar quiet of history for sleep, where every story, no matter how vast, dissolves into the steady rhythm of the night, allowing us to close our eyes and feel that history, even when lost, is still resting just beneath the surface, waiting to be found by the gentlest kind of listening. Atlantis did not sink. It simply changed shape and is still quietly reflecting us, even in the deepest stillness of sleep.